right. Good morning. Afternoon. Evening,
Good morning,
everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here. And welcome to the audience. Cool to see so much interest in our topic today. Community continues to like the education that we're doing. So we've got a good one today. Let's just do a tech check. Jason, can you see me, hear me, or can we hear you?
I can.
Excellent. Good to see you again. Davide, tech check.
Yeah, all good.
All good. Michael, tech check.
Yep, I'm here.
Awesome. Do you guys like clean, quality Salesforce code? All right. I mean, who doesn't? So we've got a good one today. It looks like the audience is coming in. There's been a lot of discussion about quality in Salesforce from a development standpoint. Salesforce continues to talk about it more proactively, the well-architected initiative. And so we've got a good one for today, and hopefully at the end of our session, everyone will have a couple of nuggets they can take back to their organization and make progress and improve things. From a logistics standpoint, everybody is on mute except for our experts that are going to be doing most of the talking. But this is interactive, and so I'll be monitoring the question and answer. And if you have question and answers or topics that you want the team to explore more fully, just feel free to put them in the questions, and we'll try to cover them. It's intended to be a discussion, not in a conversation. And if there are things that are more interesting to you or want us to double click on, we'll do it. And with that, I think let's get into some intros. All right. So Jason, let's go back one. There we go. Jason, give a little background on who you are for those that don't already know you. What informs your perspective? Maybe something that you're excited about that Salesforce is doing now.
Yep. So I'm Jason Metzger. I'm the solution engineer for Flosum. So previously to Flosum, I actually worked in a development team for Salesforce, and either fortunately for my experience, but unfortunately for my frustration, we kind of worked through that DevOps maturity curve. So we started with change sets, tried some automation with GitHub and Jenkins, and then eventually moved on to a purpose-built tool for Salesforce. So the frustrating part was learning and kind of how to adopt was painful. My experience, 2020 hindsight, very good for my experience. I'd say one thing I'm excited about with Salesforce, selfishly speaking, is they are slowly but surely bringing on support for a lot of their purchases or acquisitions for the metadata API. Good examples there: Marketing Cloud, B2C Commerce, and then Velocity. From my perspective, when teams are like, well, Salesforce has Marketing Cloud, it's like they own it, but on the back end, it's not Salesforce. So right. I'm pretty excited that everything's slowly but surely getting support there where we can automate and version everything.
Yeah, it's all going to come together eventually, right? It's all going to come together eventually. So
this
super
will be
cool.
a multi-year initiative.
Yeah, exactly. Super cool. Yeah, welcome to the conversation, and cool that you've been in the ringer, if you will, on the development side. Michael, same question to you. For those that don't know you, who are you? What informs your perspective? What are you excited about? Maybe from a Salesforce standpoint, that they're actively working on or talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. So Michael Dailey from the Provar side, work on the product marketing team. Recently switched over to that team, was working as kind of a DevOps consultant and working with our customer success team. And then prior to that was kind of in a duality of roles between sales and CS. Prior to Provar, I started with Provar about 5 years ago. I was working on a development team as well, but this was outside of the Salesforce ecosystem. It was kind of an in-house Microsoft shop. We did .NET development. We did a lot of automation with Selenium. We did a lot of Microsoft Azure work. So yeah, that's kind of where my background is. I was a developer, and that was what I wanted to do. And then I kind of shifted a little bit more into the product side, into the sales side of things as my career kind of has kicked off more. And yeah, just happy to be here. As far as the Salesforce stuff, Jason kind of stole some of my ideas there because I was going to mention that as well. I will say in the more recent news for the next release, I was excited to see that they're going to have a singular view or a way of seeing permissions across all the different things that a user has access to, which was kind of neat. Because before you have to go to permission sets, you have to go to profiles. There's not really a centralized way of viewing that. So I was kind of excited to see, what that looks like, and I'm excited to see what that holds in the future.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Yeah, you can talk with Jason afterwards about stealing your thunder. But yeah, who sees what matters, right? And being able to quickly understand what someone has, can see, that's going to help a lot of people out. For sure. And then also, for those that didn't catch it, coming from outside of Salesforce into Salesforce gives a lens into some, the nuances and or differences, pros and cons. So a lot of value for the conversation here today from Michael. And then Davide, same question. Who are you? What informs your perspective? And what are you excited about?
I'm the CTO of Clayton. I'm leading the product and engineering team. And previously, I always been working on the software development in different industries, different from Salesforce, like Amazon Web Services and other companies before. And I guess my perspective is more on the leading engineering teams. And so talking about Salesforce, actually, it's not let's say recent news, but you mentioned it and I got excited again. It's the well-architected framework because I think it's something really big and probably takes time to digest, but it's really useful for who is leading, an engineering group to have such a comprehensive framework to manage all the initiatives on different aspects, because it's covering really a lot of different aspects, not only strictly development.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's going to help the entire community. So that's a good call out. And I'm Brian. I'll be your game show host today. So your contestants are amazing. So we've got a great audience. Looks like a large group has come in. And again, we're going to keep it interactive. So I have the question session up. So if you have questions, feel free to engage. We'll pose them to the team. But with that, let's get into what we're going to go through content-wise. So agenda for today. So we'll do a high-level review of end-to-end development processes. So we'll start super high level. And kind of set the context of how this should work and things to think about. From there, we'll go into some common challenges that you have and a couple of functional areas. And then we'll do, for any questions that you haven't posed throughout the conversation, we'll do a Q&A session at the end and a lightning round for anything that we didn't get to. Got a lot of, let's get right into it. So Jason, why don't you kick off and kind of set the stage of kind of what is the end-to-end development process look like?
Yep. So a lot of times in the kind of the ecosystem, you hear CI/CD, DevOps, the SDLC process. While all of them might have their own unique definition, ultimately that end-to-end development process, I mean, you're going to plan for that project. You're going to begin building, you're going to release, deploy, monitor, and then go into operation stage. So it's kind of that never-ending infinity loop. And the overarching goal within any development team is release frequently, get constant feedback, take it into backlog, and continuously enhance that product, build new features, or troubleshoot bugs, for example. So what we'll kind of walk through today is, how teams build those requirements, how you do backlog grooming. None of these tools really have an impact to that. That process remains true. But within any development team, automation is the ultimate goal. It's very low touch, and automation is a great job. So Flosum, you think of more so as like an orchestration hub. It'll help you efficiently deploy your changes, hopefully with quality work and less rework there. Now, where I'll let Davide and Michael talk about that, but the non-functional and then functional testing, Flosum typically will integrate with those tools, where these tools pretty much work in harmony together. But I would say think of Flosum as that like air traffic controller, governance org, or like the orchestration hub, where all metadata and code will flow through.
Awesome. And so from Michael, anything else that you would add to the overall process or kind of the capability around the functional testing at this point?
Yeah, I would just say the importance of kind of the relationship between your QAs and developers throughout this process. Being from a testing side of things, that's the perspective that we have, but we also want to be cognizant of QAs are working with developers and they're meant to be on the same team, right? But that's not always the case. You may have the developers doing their work and then they kind of hand it over to the QAs and they're testing things, and then maybe that feedback process is not the best. So any kind of automation there, to Jason's point, definitely helps smooth out the process because then you're not as reliant on manual effort to kind of drive the whole thing, and there's not as many stop gaps and red tape in the way. So as much automation as possible is definitely helpful from the testing side of things to free up the QAs to do more like exploratory type testing, which is a newer type of testing that more people are looking into these days, where they're kind of testing those edge cases, right? So not the things that you would normally see necessarily, but we all know from using any product, there's customers that are going to use things in a way that they're not intended to be used. So testing for those types of scenarios is important as well. Yeah, and I would just say that this is an iterative process, right? You get better as you go along.
Yeah, good call out. Davide, anything to add? Or what would you add?
Yeah, no, I would add there are some keywords that are very important that Jason and Michael mentioned, like feedback. So I think the whole goal of this is to get feedbacks as soon as possible, and there are different type of feedbacks that you can get, from this pipeline that you want to build in order to release your product. And as soon as you can get the feedback, the better, because obviously you can iterate, and this is the second keyword. This is a iterative process. So the goal is get feedbacks very soon, and then be able to quickly iterate on whatever is the issue, or how you can improve it, essentially.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Makes a ton of sense. And I think the thing that I liked about each of what you just said is that, the slide kind of looks, serial in nature, 1, 2, 3. But what I really resonate with, and for the audience, is those curved lines of feedback. It's those rounded edges that are really iterative and require feedback be done on the edges and in an iterative way and in real time to the extent that it can, through automation that allows you to really do it well, right? If you think of it just as a straight line and serial process, you likely won't have accomplished very much. It's kind of the legacy approach. Let me just do a quick check. No questions as of yet. So anything else to add to? Oh yeah, yeah. So in terms of for the audience, working through this process, assessing where they are. Yeah, the maturity model, Jason. It's a great way to figure out where you are on your journey and where to go next.
Yeah, so I'll touch base on this. So why should teams care about this, or why should you actually kind of figure out where you are on that? It's always benchmark your performance. And some teams might not require to be leading in the DevOps maturity model, but a lot of times when I'm talking to teams in the aspiring or the starting stage, they can feel this metaphorical tidal wave or kind of this invisible wall of work coming within their pipeline, and they know something within their process needs to change. That this big project or massive amount of work, the tooling they have in place is not going to be able to keep up with the demand from the business. So if your team's recently stood up Salesforce, a lot of teams start in the aspiring stage. You use change sets, and sometimes teams are making changes directly in production. They don't have any sandboxes. I always say you are playing with fire in that instance. It takes a couple times to really learn that you're making changes in production. When the business is in there, you're going to learn really quick that you need some sandboxes. Now, change sets might be good for, let's just say, 1 to 5 people. You can get through planning. It's manual, but it's attainable. Once you have developers start working parallel to each other, you're developing and you're working towards that one release, you might start exploring maybe using VS Code and SFDX commands, or maybe you kind of upgrade to DevOps Center. But you're still kind of working at starting stage in a shared sandbox. Now, the pros of that is everyone starts from the same source, which is great. But as project complexity grows and your team is really scaling in size, you're having a lot of cooks in that same kitchen. And that's really where Flosum comes in. And a lot of our customers are starting in that building stage where you're starting to automate some things. You're starting to entertain that branching strategy and figuring out what's the most effective and efficient way. And then developers are adopting the individual sandbox strategy, where in my sandbox, it's just my work. It's segregated to me. But then the issue comes in with multiple sandboxes is now we're kind of manually backputting those changes. You want to avoid a sandbox refresh. They're painful. Now, one thing I will say, from building to leading and then refining, these are pretty big leaps. A lot of teams will eventually make it to refining, and that's their end goal, which is totally fine. But refining, I would say the big thing, it's very data driven. You're starting to collect metrics. Like, what's your average lead time? What's your change failure rate? How often is your team releasing to production, and how many components exist in each? It can actually give you pretty good metrics for baking into sprint and project planning. And then with that refining process, you're starting to integrate your automated testing tools. You're starting to enforce those quality checks. They're not ad hoc anymore. And in addition to the refining in the leading stage, a lot of times Salesforce, it's going to be a mission critical application. It started off just for the sales team, collecting all their opportunities, their leads, et cetera. But now within businesses, every single business unit is using Salesforce. So then you have to start factoring, what's your disaster recovery plan? If you lose data or do a bad data load job, how are you going to recover from that? And then the final stage is leading. So with refining and building, the goal is to automate everything. But if you're working with 30, 50, 100, 300 developers, it's really hard to understand like what's in that metadata at all times. Are you introducing vulnerabilities into production that your human set of eyes, it's not going to catch everything? That's really where the DevSecOps team or play comes in. Now, teams always ask, well, what if we don't require to go to a leading or refining or a building? And that's totally fine. A good example is one of our customers, they have around 30 Salesforce production works. Now, 20 of those, it's very demanding. They're constantly releasing changes, but maybe 10 of those orgs, for the most part, they're kind of stagnant. The business is happy. They're in there every day, but it might be an occasional, you add a pick list value to a layout. You're increasing field level security. Maybe you don't require full-blown automation for that. So it all depends on where your team is in that maturity model and where you want to go.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and knowing where you are is the basis for making progress. And so,
Yep.
actually, let's take. I'm going to kick off a poll here. And Michael, as I kick this off, because it'd be great to find out where the audience is. Where is the market? Where is everybody? What's your sense?
I would probably say it's kind of like a bell curve. I would imagine that most folks find themselves somewhere in the building area, maybe around there. I would say that a lot of people are past kind of the aspiring phase, hopefully at this point, where they're moving away from change sets and they recognize that change sets are the way of the past, of the way of doing things. Just taking a step back here, I'm not the biggest fan of maturity models. I'll say I look at them almost like standardized tests for school, where you would start the year, you would take the test to kind of see where you're at. But that's really all they are, right? They really are that standardized test where you're seeing kind of where you are in relation to maybe the broader picture. And so it may not be the most specific way of identifying all the things that you need to improve. But my favorite part about all this is that you won't see any specific tool being mentioned when you're looking at these maturity models and you're looking at DevOps best practices. It's all about people and processes, really. The tools help you accomplish your goals, but if you don't have the people with the right mindset and the right processes in place, then those tools aren't going to solve the problems in themselves. So that's kind of my favorite part about looking at this and thinking about it more from an automation perspective too. You're starting with automation at the forefront, which I think is a very good thing, because you need to be thinking about it as early on as possible. It's not, let's get all the processes in place, let's do it all manual, and then once we get to leading, let's start automating. You're automating as you go. So you're minimizing your tech debt, you're minimizing all the things that you need to do in order to be successful for the future.
Love it. And I think we just got over 50% participation rate, so I think I shared. Is that showing up on your screens? Can you see the results?
On my screen, yes. It's exactly a bell curve.
It's exactly a bell curve. So surprising, and this is self-identification. So I don't know if people self-identify that they're farther along or worse off? Davide, yeah, first take on the poll results.
Yeah, Michael won. He got the right answer. No, I think, yeah, I mean, actually, obviously, this is as any model, like, it's it's a starting point, I guess, to classify things. It's very complex, and actually, the research behind this model is showing much more than tools, actually, and it's talking about burnout and how all this stuff, all together, the process, the tools, can help the team to to a successful, let's say, work life. But yeah, it's starting point to identify where you are, just to know what are your next step. And but yeah, it's amazing that we got exactly the answer that we were expecting.
Yeah, that's funny. That's great. All right, let's so we still don't have any questions. The audience is participating, but not engaged as of yet. So why don't we jump into our into some of the column challenges, and we stop sharing here, and yeah, let's start with orchestration.
Yeah, so from Flosum's perspective, working a lot in the pre-sales with a lot of our customers, one of the benefits is I get to hear what I think is everything and anything that the problems they faced. But these are the 3 common pain points that I hear across development teams, across verticals, across teams' maturities and size. Number 1 and 2 kind of go together, but they are separate in my mind. The biggest thing teams always ask is, well, my sandboxes are out of sync, and the sandbox refresh process is painstaking. It takes days to get that org restable again. And then in addition to that, my branches are out of sync. And that's even when you have version control. And as your team scales and grows, keeping that pipeline and all of your branches and orgs in sync, it typically becomes a full-time job for either one resource or multiple resources. Now, here's a couple scenarios of how branches and orgs get out of sync. Some of our customers might realize, like in production, they have a production support team. And these admins might be making very low-risk changes, in my opinion, field level security for a profile or permission, a field to a page layout, a pick list value. But then the issue is, how do you get those manual changes back in sync with master? Because when you're opening a pull request, master might not be an exact replica of production. It could result in overwrites. And then as teams scale, maybe you have multiple releases working in parallel, and those releases might have staggered release dates. Well, if release 1 goes, someone needs to push those changes backwards to the other 2 release branches. If not, you're wildly out of sync. And the argument is, like, do the tools allow that visibility? Do they give you warning ahead of time? Are those back promotions automated or manual? But the more and more you're doing this, the less there's a need for sandbox refreshes, the more in sync your branches are with each other and the org, less conflicts, and then more predictable deployments. Because sometimes you deploy to QA, everything looks good. Bundle to a release, deploy to UAT, and you're thinking, why is this incorrect? Because your orgs are out of sync. You're just looking at different results. And the second one, this kind of leads into it, conflict resolution. Now, with change sets, you don't have any of that. You have no visibility in your changes. It takes that file from your sandbox, bulldozes any work in the target org you're deploying to. But after change sets, teams will typically go to DevOps Center, outgrow that. The next logical thing is Git and Jenkins, typically. It works cross-platform for other tools, phenomenal. Just apply it to Salesforce. There's Salesforce is its own unique beast, though. Everything is typically in XML file format. So I always ask teams, well, if you have version control, why is conflict resolution such a pain for you? XML files in Git instances can lead to a lot of false conflicts. And speaking from experience, flows are not the easiest to resolve conflicts for, because it's kind of looking at hieroglyphics, in my opinion. I remember one time, like, talking to our lead engineer. I'm like, I don't really know how to resolve this. There was multiple people working on the same flow. It was a shoot from the hip type moment. We'll just take the source file. We'll deal with the repercussions later, because the view I was looking at, I could not decipher what was going to happen. And of course, there was rework with my bugs. And the third and final is siloed tooling. So I've heard it all. One of the craziest examples I've heard from a customer of the past, or last year, they were using Bitbucket, Jira, JFrog, TeamCity, and UDeploy, all to deploy their changes. And one of the common pain points they have was the error messages we're getting aren't clear. And I couldn't really understand that because every tool uses the API to deploy. And if I don't see an error message I know, Google it. There's tons of Salesforce blogs about how to resolve it. Diving into their process a bit more, the errors they were getting were in new deploy, which, evidently speaking, I've never used that before. And I'm looking at the error message, I'm like, I can't really help you here. Maybe Google it. But that was a huge bottleneck in their process, because then you have to talk to the product owner, get an architect on there, troubleshoot it. So it's a huge process where it can greatly slow you down. And for verticals like health and life sciences, federal customers, or financial industries, the siloed tooling, if you get audited, it's like the information's there, but it's not in one concise area. So a lot of times, your requirements are in Jira, your audit trail might be in Git for Git blame, and then the Salesforce audit trails, but then you're exporting that in a CSV, doing VLOOKUPs, and it's costly. It just takes time to have that breadcrumb trail of how did it come from an idea all the way to a solution? Did it work through that proper process? So those are not all limited to the issues we solve or challenges we encounter, but those are the 3 common pain points that almost every single development team has in one way or another.
Yeah, 100%. Context on that, Davide or Michael, any surprising, or is this line up? Any other color to add?
I don't know what you're talking about, Jason. I've never met anyone whose orgs and branches are out of sync. That never happens.
Yeah,
I would say that's probably the most common one that I've ran into as well. I mean, even personally, but working with our clients and prospects, a lot of times from a testing perspective, that's an interesting problem to solve, because a lot of times you may get a test that's failing in your sandbox org, but maybe it passes in a higher level environment. So that's something that's interesting to see as well. And I thought what you were saying there about, it really all comes down to what the source of truth is for what you're trying to do. And like you said, if you have admins and developers working in tandem in the same environment, then the source control, the repository, can't be the source of truth, because that's not where the admin operates. That's where the developer operates. So it's almost like the modern development best practices of doing everything in version control and utilizing that as the source of truth not necessarily falls apart, but I think there are some gaps there that you need to work through if that's kind of your way of doing things. Being from a non-Salesforce background, that was shocking to me that, oh yeah, version control is everything. If it's not in the repo, it doesn't exist. That's main is prod. Main equals prod. But I think with Salesforce, it's different, because there's CPQ to think about as well. There's data that needs to be deployed sometimes in order for an environment to be stood up. So yeah, that I would just say that this is not surprising to me at all.
I follow all the Salesforce influencers on LinkedIn, and they put out a poll. This was probably a month ago, about like, what really is your source of truth? Is it production, because that's what the business sees, that's what they're using, or is it your master branch? Of course, grab the popcorn, look at all the comments, and it blurs the lines, because if production goes down, is master in sync? Can you restore everything with the click of a button? Likely times, not a lot of time. So it's like, is production that source of truth? Master can help you get there and recover quicker, but there's still going to be some manual work associated with it.
100%. Yeah, and what we have we got a question coming in, and then just cognizant of time, then we'll keep trying to progress forward. So a question from the audience: how do you determine what goes in the repo and what doesn't, i.e. working in tandem with the admin?
I would say anything that is supported by the metadata API, by default, it should be in the repository, because that is, I always say, your insurance policy. If something goes wrong, you can always go back and look at historical versions, restore from that, and back promote. Now, of course, the challenging part in Salesforce is not every component has API support. So there is sometimes pre and post deployment work associated with your deployment or even restoring from it. So at minimum within Flosum, what a lot of our teams will do is you can actually compare your production org to your master branch. Teams might do this daily, weekly, once a month, but you can see the deltas, what's missing, what's different. And essentially what they'll do is they'll take those deltas from production, merge it back into master. That way master is a spitting replica of production at that point in time. Cool.
Michael, Davide, agreed? All right, let's go. So just cognizant of time, let's pop to the the common challenges of non-functional testing, which I think we have next.
Yeah.
Davide, do you want to kick off here?
Yeah.
And
So
questions we'll take, so keep them coming. Go ahead.
yeah, I would say so. The top three, actually, the first two are connected. So the main problem is that, unfortunately, often the teams are obviously focused on development itself. So like the testing part of development are kind of an aftermath and something that you will worry about only when it's a problem, maybe in production, if it's really too late. But you see here, the problem is, as I was saying before, that actually instead you should, as you know, a best practice is to shift left, as they say. So you should get these feedbacks about the non-functional, let's say, requirements or any other type of issues as soon as possible during development, so that you can actually solve them as quickly as possible, because the soon you are aware of a problem near the development itself, the better is and easier is the resolution path. Instead, if you realize only after you deployed, or anyway after weeks of when the development was done, obviously it will take time to recognize where was the problem and who is actually responsible to work and solve it. And on the other side of the coin, the problem is that whatever you use in order to detect these type of issues, if it's noisy, if it gets noisy, which means that you get a lot of false positives, that's obviously it's the flip side of the coin, where the team then doesn't look anymore after these problems if honestly it's the human nature that as soon as something looks a little bit okay, this is not really a problem, then you will ignore from that time on, you will ignore all the let's say all the signals that you get from that tool. So that's another big issue, because allegedly you have the tool in place, the pipeline, whatever, but the team is just keep going. And then the last one is that, as I said, a lot of these will take time to solve, and then the best is when you really get the information of something that is off closer to the development, the time you actually introduced this problem, or anyway you were working on that component that has this problem, because otherwise will take just a lot of time to context switch, get to understand again what was doing that component, and go through the whatever is the information that you finally got. And so I would say these are the common pitfalls when we are talking about non-functional tests. But in general, I would say when the team gets feedback about something that is off in their development.
Makes a ton of sense. And it would to me. I talk to Davide every day, right? Michael or Jason, anything else, a color to add to what you see on the non-functional? And yeah, you can leave it here. Yeah, you can go forward, Claudia. But Michael or Jason, other color you see on the static analysis non-functional side?
The false positives are a huge one. I've seen teams that just gets lit up like a Christmas tree with all false positives, and there might be some truth to those, but a lot of times teams will actually disable the quality checks because it takes too much time to figure out, well, what's actually an issue versus what is just a false positive, and they'll not enforce it and then eventually not have a product adoption because they don't trust the results. It's in turn just really slowing them down in the process.
Yeah, and actually, like where Clayton is, let's say, is focusing a lot is on reliability, on what we detect is an actual problem. And then obviously there are anyway, cases where you want to ignore problems, but there is a workflow, let's say, to do that, but only because sometimes obviously there are other constraints that are outside of, let's say, the computer science area.
100%. 100%. Michael, any other color from your standpoint on non-functional, or should we get into functional? All right.
Yeah, good to move on.
Cool. So common pain points in functional testing. And Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think these will come as a surprise for anyone who's done any type of testing, especially in Salesforce or any kind of development world. These are three of the most common ones that we see. It definitely comes up quite often. The first one here, testing being a blocker. Really what we mean by this is a lot of times if you go back to that DevOps, grid diagram that we showed earlier and you look at the infinity loop, you may see a small segment of that is dedicated to testing. And what that translates to if you're doing sprint-based development is you may have a 2-week sprint and maybe 2 days, at the very end, that's when you do all your testing. You try to cram everything in. Let's verify all the user stories manually. Let's do all this. But what ends up happening a lot of the time is it takes more than 2 days and your release gets delayed, or that leads into the second pain point. You end up having to compromise on your release quality. You say, okay, what are the highest priority, the highest risk items that we need to tackle up front in terms of testing? Let's make sure those are passing so we can actually release this because we have obligations. We have to move forward. We have to release on time, that kind of thing. So you don't want to have to delay the release. So the alternative is, okay, let's not test as much. Let's go for 70% maybe of our 100% of our test cases. Let's only test about 70% of those scenarios instead. And so what you end up having is bugs in production that you probably could have predicted and prevented had you had more time to test. But as we all know, we can't just add more time into, it would be nice to have an 8th day of a week, right? That would maybe help solve a lot of these problems. But I think we would end up in the same cycle, even with an additional day where we're kind of leaving it to the end because we think, oh yeah, we can just test this real quick. It'll work. We know the developers signed off on it. All the non-functional tests are passing, right? So that should mean that all the functional testing is passing as well. Everything works in the UI. The user is able to do it, but that's not always the case. There's back-end integrations. There's end-to-end processes that need to be validated that kind of get in the way of things. And I guess the third most common one that I see is just the resource intensiveness and the repetitive nature of testing. And that's why probably a lot of people hear the word testing and they get a bad taste in their mouth, almost like, maybe you're thinking of like a taxes and having to do that kind of thing. You look at testing in a similar light, right? So
we're you caught me off guard there with the taxes. Yeah, that's you hit a nerve.
It was just tax day over here in the US a couple days ago too. So maybe that's a little too close to home. But that's the goal really of automation, is to remove the repetitive aspects of testing, because with anything that you're doing over and over again, as you know, there's chances for human error. There's chances for someone to miss things. If you're not doing it the exact same way every time, if it's not the same person doing the test, they could do it a little bit differently. There's interpretation of the actual manual test that they may do the test completely differently than someone else. And it's just very resource intensive. It's not scalable in the sense that you can't just hire more and more manual testers to say, okay, if we have 2 testers today and it takes us 2 days to do our testing, let's hire 2 more. So that way we have 4, and then we should be able to do it in 1 day, right? But that's not how scalability works in the software development world. And that's not how it works in the testing world either. So automation is definitely meant to kind of help solve that problem.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Davide, Jason, color to add?
This is me being nosy now, Michael, but so typically when teams come from like a Git and Jenkins build, the cross-platform tool of choice for regression testing, Selenium. Salesforce teams, I'll talk to them, they will drag their feet through it, but typically they have a enterprise team that's pushing it down on them. Wondering like what the differences are between like a Selenium and a Provar.
Yeah, that's a good question. And coming from a Selenium background, I can speak to that firsthand. A lot of the issues that Selenium was meant to handle are kind of similar to these common pain points, right? But the primary thing there is Selenium is just a framework. It's an open source framework. You do still need to be a developer, and you do still need to be an engineer to build and write those tests. And there's no guarantee that those tests are going to be, the same in terms of the pass or fail. They could change over time, right? So what you're testing, in this case, if you're testing Salesforce, we all know is a very dynamic application. You know, the DOM is always subject to change per the Salesforce developer guide. The advent of Lightning Web Components and different modern technologies in Salesforce make it very challenging to change using open source tooling like Selenium, because there's really no native way to go about that process. And so you end up having to have someone who's very well versed in Selenium and automation, but then they also have to know Salesforce. They also have to know your business processes. So it ends up being a very, very costly resource that you have to have in order to kind of adopt the Selenium framework. And then you're just adopting more tech debt for testing, which is not really ideal when you're already trying to minimize your tech debt for your software development.
Makes a ton of sense. Makes a ton of sense. So, yeah, I guess, yeah, you kind of covered this a little bit there. Jason, I don't know if you saw the deck before, but you gave him a layup. He was ready. He was ready for a question on that topic. So everyone's still here. So it's a quiet audience today, but they're all still here, and it's a big group. So I'll do a call out for any additional questions from the audience. So, you know, while we're doing that, feel free to put them in. And but they're quiet today. They're quiet. They're just taking in all the value and Christmas tree lights and taxes. And so having said that, maybe I'll start with you, Davide. What are the best companies do differently? The companies that do this well, like what's different?
Yeah. Well, first of all, is like to start, let's say high level. First of all, it's to really have a clear, let's say, understanding and then communication around what is the pipeline what the pipeline looks like. Because I think here, okay, we are taking it from a perspective of different tools, how they come together, but everything should start from obviously the team and the company, how they want to anyway approach the problem or how we want to release the software, right? So it touches various, I mean, a lot of points of the development itself, actually even multiple teams, because as Michael was saying, if you have a team dedicated to QA, for instance. So I think the best players, they start designing this process across teams, and they start having a very clear picture and communicating this to each team and then implementing it. That's crucial. And also how they involve the team itself, or the different teams to be part of this, because obviously in order to work, whatever you implement, the team has to be involved. Otherwise, there is no process that will not fall apart if the kind of it's working against the let's say the players of this game, that are the team members, obviously.
Yep. Team first, team and process first, tool second or third. Jason, how about you? What do you see? What are the companies that don't do this well? What do they do poorly? Or where do they break down?
I'd say it's stuck in their ways. Every project within Salesforce is different. The requirements are different, the complexity. So being agile, maybe adjusting your testing environments, maybe bringing on additional resources, adjusting your branching strategy, your release cadence, having that understanding of what is this going to require ahead of time. And maybe the first 2 sprints, there's a couple bottlenecks, maybe manual process is not function as expected. It's more so of a journey. You can tweak that process. So maybe sprints 3 and 4, you test out your theory, go back and refine that. So it's being agile and being able to adopt to the people within your team, the maturity, the requirements, etc.
Yep. Yeah.
I totally agree. Like there is this actually one thing that also it's important that I came to my mind when Jason was talking, is that like it's not that one size fits all. Like even within the same organization, like there are different teams, different projects. This is always a challenge, and the best organization that can adapt, they understand that agility, it's a mindset, let's say, right? So you need to expect that things will change, and it changes by team, by product, or whatever is as you want to look at it. There is no
100%.
one solution.
Yep, 100%. Michael, do you have anything else to add? We did get some questions, but anything else to add on what works and versus what doesn't?
I'm actually excited to get in these questions. This first question that I just saw here I think is a great question, and I was really hoping to get to that one.
All right, so we've got about 12 minutes, so we'll do a lightning round on questions. So question number 1, I know a lot of this has been scaling up, but how do you recommend scaling down for a small team of 3 developers, admins? What maturity level makes sense? When does automation overhead become not worth it? Michael.
Yeah, I can take this one first. I'm sure Jason, you have some comments that you'll want to add as well. I think that this really is a good question because it's really about, where are we spending our time, which is really kind of the whole point of this conversation about best practices is how you're going about your work, how you're spending your resources. So I think this is a good question to be asking to begin with, because there are some scenarios where maybe the amount of automation that you're implementing, there's a running joke on kind of the developer community for anyone who's familiar with like Kubernetes and things like that. Everyone always thinks that you need to have a Kubernetes cluster for everything. You need to have like the most advanced architecture, even for the most simplest application. But a lot of times that's not, it can be a little overkill. So I think thinking about what you're doing manually over and over again, for me, from my perspective, if I do something more than 3 times manually, I think back, okay, I probably need to think about a way that I can automate that so I don't have to keep doing that. That's probably the simplest way to think about it in terms of automation, right? If it's a test that I'm only going to be running once or twice a year, it's probably not worth the amount of effort to put into automating that scenario because it's something that you could do manually in much less time, right? As far as actually creating a test and executing it, we'll all agree that doing it manually is going to be faster one time. But the automation and the kind of the benefits of doing everything through an automated way and not just testing comes into play when you're talking about multiple iterations. So I think you have to think about how often you're doing a process or a task or a test. And that's really where the kind of the decision point comes into play.
Makes a ton of sense. Anything else to
add?
add?
Add one to that too. Like automation is great, but the team has to be ready for it. It does take upfront work from one processes because everyone has to be aligned on it. If you have varying processes, like automation will do what it's told to do, but if there's deviation in that process, you're not going to have the results you expected. So Robert, to answer that question about scaling down, like with 3 members on your team, to be honest, I'd say work out of a shared sandbox. Just when you're doing your sprint planning or requirements planning, just be sure that, me, Brian, and Michael, we're not touching that same component at once. So a little bit of planning does go a long way. And then depending on projects too, a lot of teams will have like a development, integration, QA, maybe 2 UAT environments in production. If you're scaling down, it's a very simple project. You probably don't require that many testing environments because it's going to slow you down. Some smaller teams might have development and then they merge into or deploy into a full copy, test their work there. If they like their results, deploy straight to production.
Yep. Yeah, maybe the only thing that I would add, and then we'll move on to some of the others, is the impact of failure. So the criticality of what you're releasing, even with a small team, if it's severely detrimental to the business, if you put out a bad release, that would be a consider of automation, even at low volume.
Yeah, can I add one thing, Brian? Because I was thinking it's not only a matter of the size of the team, also the seniority. So if you work already in a, let's say, in a very automated environment, even if you are a small team, maybe you are ready to implement whatever automation because you know your way to do it. You know already what to expect. But because the problem, as we said, that sometimes it's a process, so you need to tune automation. You need to know a little bit what are the pain points, because the automation, it's very helpful, but sometimes could also be noisy because maybe you were too restrictive with whatever was thing you were doing, and you get a lot of of these signals here, and then the teams get frustrated very, very quickly. So I would add this component. Like if you know already a bit of it, maybe you are ready to implement it. If you start from scratch, from no background on automation and all this stuff, yeah, you have also to consider that. So take a little bit more time to implement it, independent from the size of the team.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good call. That's a good call. Cool. Let's go get the next question. Does Clayton support Salesforce Industries, formerly Velocity? Yes. So that's a quick lightning round one. Another one for Jason. Jason, you got a call out. Nice. What issues did you encounter when using GitHub and Jenkins to run automation?
All right. So this is gonna be a wordy answer, but starting off, like I was an admin. So learning Git and learning kind of the automation piece of it, it was a beast for me. It took years, 2.5 years, to be honest with you. And I still don't consider myself an expert by any means. So one, it was the learning curve. And then two, like I said earlier, like the branches in my org always being out of sync. And I deployed a QA, go on lunch break, come back, and there's 4 bugs associated with it. The one story that always, it's like tattooed in my brain, went on vacation for a week. Nice, relaxing, come back to Monday refreshed. I look in GitHub and I'm 95 commits behind master. So it's not as easy. I wish it was as easy as just clicking back to rote changes. Well, there's an order of operation for those commits. After like the 5th or 6th failure, I'm not doing this. This is going to take 3 days to get myself back in sync. Go to a sandbox refresh, load my sandbox with data, set up the environment variables. So the biggest thing there was just visibility, like knowing when I'm out of sync and easily be able to troubleshoot. Like if the automation isn't working or Git isn't working, I don't need to go rely on the enterprise architect to go help me and hold my hand through all that. So I'd say like an intuitive UI from an admin's perspective, I think it goes a long way because I wasn't an expert in Jenkins. I didn't write the scripts. I just knew how to click run and it would execute for me. If something goes wrong though, I can't be a resource. I need to go pull someone else in.
Cool. Davide, Michael, anything to add to that?
I would add, here again, it's like, for instance, I have a lot of experience with Jenkins and GitHub. Our team, because overall we got experience, let's say, besides Salesforce. So we were using another, let's say, platforms before. But yeah, like they are very powerful, but generic. So yeah, I agree with Jason that obviously if they're not really, there isn't anything about Salesforce in GitHub or Jenkins. So you really need to know both in order to make them work nicely together. But it's for sure powerful, both Jenkins and GitHub, but there is a lot to do in order to make them work with Salesforce.
Cool.
Yeah.
We had a couple more questions, but we're coming up on time, and we went longer than expected, but everybody's engaged. So cool. Let's if we go to the next slide, maybe just the final takeaway. And we'll start with you, Michael. What should people do tomorrow? So coming in on Wednesday, what's the first step people should take that participated and listened here today?
Well, if you're in the US, you need to do your taxes if you haven't already, because you're behind.
You're behind. Missed it. Had you had automation, you wouldn't have missed the date, right?
True. I would say, definitely just, there's no one size fits all approach, right? Everything that we talked about here today is, we refer to as best practices, but I think every industry functions differently. You all have different roles. Everyone has different levels of experience. I always encourage people to kind of look at what they have internally first and look at the processes that are in play, and not necessarily thinking about what tool do I need to use to solve this problem, but think about what the actual problems are associated with the peoples and processes that are already at play. And then think about, okay, where are areas that we could improve? What are some things that we could be doing better? And then start the exploration process of, okay, maybe this solution could provide me a solution for my problem based on kind of what we've evaluated. And that's going to look different, based on your company, based on what you're doing in terms of your Salesforce development process. So yeah, I would always encourage people, if you're already using GitHub, if you're already using Jenkins, if you're already using Selenium, those are all very great tools in and of themselves, and I've used all of them in the past. I think they're all kind of generic, purpose built for everything, right? So the only caveat there is that, to Davide's point and Jason's point, is that they're not purpose built for Salesforce development. So there's a lot of things that you have to kind of make work for your scenario that aren't as portable, that aren't as scalable, that you need to be thinking about if you're talking about reusing and continuing those tools.
Yep. And always start, like you said, with where you are. Start internally, processes and opportunities for improvement before looking for the next shiny object. And if you need a shiny object, Michael, Davide, and Jason have a shiny object to share. Davide, maybe the same question. What should people do tomorrow?
Well, I think first of all, if you don't have any automation, you need to start building some automation around your processes. But then, as we have seen, a lot of people is already doing CI/CD. So the next step is to try to get to the next level and just remember, focus on the principles. So the principles about, let's say, automation is to get feedbacks as quick as possible and get to be able to iterate. And so you need to get this pipeline to work smoothly for your team and be able to essentially move quickly from one stage to the other. And obviously quickly is, it's a generic term, but the point is probably to go back to what Michael said. You don't have to try to build everything, from scratch now and start with a big plan, but incrementally add, further steps. It's really a journey, and you need to start having a clear idea of where you are. What are the, let's say, policies that you want to implement in your process, and start measuring the adoption of one or two of these policies, like more testing or non-functional testing, and then iterate, improve, and eventually, when you feel mature, go further in this journey.
100%. And then, Jason, last item. So tomorrow, above and beyond, from Michael and Davide, what else should people do?
I'd say if the teams aren't doing this already, maybe after every sprint or production release, have a half-hour session for lessons learned to see where you personally struggled throughout that project or sprint, or where the team did. Because if it's just me having manual changes and I'm doing the manual work, it's a me problem. But if across the board, the team is having those manual changes and it's eating into deployment time, that's a team problem. So you can coordinate and communicate, well, how could we automate that or greatly reduce that challenge? And maybe it's a tooling issue. Maybe I just didn't know the process and there's a workaround for that issue. So with any tool, whether it's Clayton, Flosum, or Provar, I always say, or any tool in the market space, it doesn't eliminate the need to collaborate and communicate across your team. Because if everyone's on that same page and you can troubleshoot and figure out workarounds for it or greatly reduce it, you will find success in any tool. If you're not collaborating, not communicating, it's going to be really tough to implement a tool to automate, to increase your velocity when we're all working in our own individual silos.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Actually, Jason said something really, really important, that I think a very good thing when you implement automation, that it's not anymore a problem of an individual, it becomes more a team problem. So it actually, in my opinion, it helps to start the discussion, how we configure it, how we will do this, how we will do that. Instead, before that step, before the automation, it's more like a one-person problem usually.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we're hitting it here. So this has been a fun session. Jason, Michael, Davide, thanks for joining and sharing your expertise. For the audience, the SMEs, they're available. I think they're on LinkedIn. You guys might be on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with them, touch base with any of them individually or any of us individually, or there's a website that you all can access to get more information. And we're here to help. And gentlemen, enjoy the rest of the day. Everyone have a great week, and we'll chat again soon.